we're just going to get started. So thanks to everyone for coming down for the briefing as well. My name is Sam. I am the coach for the ACJC Oratory and Debating Society, and we're here to give you a background on Orator's Trophy, which is going to be held on the 15th of February, and this is a briefing for the teachers, and just to give you an outline of the format of the event, the criteria for judging, as well as some of the preparation and drills that you can do to help the students prepare for this as well. So the key differences for this particular competition from other oratory events are as follows. One, every single speech is going to be an impromptu speech. That means that the students will be given the topics 5 minutes prior to their speech, and they have to prepare it on their own without help from coaches and other individuals, and they are also not allowed to access the internet. This is quite different from some of the other speech events, such as the Plain English Speaking Awards by the YMCA, which usually features a preparation speech, a prepared speech rather, where they are allowed to spend some time researching and doing it, and then subsequently they get to practice the impromptu. So this is one key difference. The second aspect, right, is that even after preparing the speech for 5 minutes, they have to deliver all of their speeches without the use of notes and without the use of prompts. So this is something that is quite challenging for them, especially if this is going to be the first oratory event that they go to. And another special feature that this particular competition has is that there are both minimum and maximum speaking times for the speeches. In other tournaments, it's only the maximum time that usually features, and you can stand up and just scream a word like reformasi, and that still counts as a speech. But for this particular tournament in ACJC, you have to make the minimum timing of 2 minutes before it constitutes a speech. So if the speech ends at 1 minute 48, and even if that was the best speech that you've ever heard, the judges still cannot give any points for that speech at all. So this is something for them to keep in mind. So what are the criteria established? Now, here we just want to note the following thing, that we do have a judging criteria that is established, which is going to be a little bit more articulated compared to some other oratory events, where it might be a little bit more flexible and is left to the discretion of the judges in many cases, or they may have judging rubrics which are not released to the individuals, lest they try to gain specifically for them. We're going to release the judging criteria, but we are still leaving it to the judges, to interpret some of these things. So there is a little bit of subjectivity involved, even though the basic foundational requirements for each of the criteria still holds true. So the judges' criteria, it's going to be an average of the 3 judges, notes in the room if there are 3 judges, if not, or 2 judges, So generally you have to impress all the judges there. And the way that it works is that the chief judge in each room will be given your overall comments at the end of each round, So feedback will be provided, but not speaker by speaker and not after every single speech, because that really will slow everything down and we want to keep things moving. And this is the way that the criteria is going to be broken down. Content 45%, delivery 35%, and language 20%. And what do each of these categories mean? We'll actually go into that right now. So content. A few key things that we're looking at when we're looking at content. Keep in mind that it is okay for the contestants to approach it and decide on a speech which will be more argumentative, almost like an argumentative essay being articulated, or it can actually be more narrative driven, can be a little bit more descriptive as well. But the key thing is you need to make sure that you're answering or responding to the question and the topics, and that there is a great deal of relevance. They need to either explicitly or implicitly show that this is something they've looked into. Some students essentially may have prepared some speeches before, and they will deliver those speeches regardless of the topic, and we often see a great disconnect between the topic and the speeches that they deliver, and then you'll be marked down on this content. But a few things as they deliver these points, especially if they are using argumentative type of essays and want to take a certain position and are providing a logical rationale for why they stand for something and how they respond to this, we do need them to, beyond assertion, prove, right, logically some basic premises. They need to link their points together, explain what the causal relationship between why a certain characteristic tends to lead to a certain outcome. And the use of examples is always welcome, but not just to throw the examples in there, but to really explain what the examples are and how they're relevant. I mean, this is basic good communication in trying to create a very visual imagery, but this also matters when it comes to the use of content and the content score as well. Notice that there are a couple of different approaches that they can use. We actually just want to assure people that you can have speakers that are going to take a very wide-ranging, broad, let's look at society, let's look at what's happening on the global scene, that's fine. But they can also decide to, we'll just go focus, we'll look at the life of an individual and talk about it. It could be a very personal story as well. That's perfectly okay. However, within the time frame that they have, they need to manage this well. So usually, right, focusing on one type or the other works out a little bit better, but if they can actually find a way to have variation from big picture to small, that's fine as well, and that's a skill set that we'll look out for in this case. In terms of delivery, we're looking for the two following criteria. I'll just go straight to that. One, is the speech clear, right? Basic communications, can it actually be, right? So that means that are the speakers, basically speaking, slow enough for people to be able to understand them? Or are they letting the adrenaline get to them and they're actually speaking too fast? Do they actually enunciate and articulate their words clearly? The end consonants are present, making sure that the words are not rolling into each other. So this is important. Pronunciation and making sure that basic, proper English pronunciation is present. We allow for variations in accent, right? And that this is something that you really cannot correct, and it's unfair to correct in some cases. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can just be using the wrong pronunciations, right? So unless the student happens to be, even if the student is French, right? It's still going to be Colonel Sanders for KFC, not Colonel Sanders as well. So we have to respect, right, the English pronunciation in this case. And are they loud enough to be heard by everyone, right? But at the same time, are they being, if they're too loud and they're basically screaming, then it's also very hard to understand. So this is very basic. Is your speech clear enough to be understood? Because without clarity, it doesn't really matter how convincing it is. People just didn't get your speech. The second part is, how convincing have you made your speech? And this is how you manipulate your speech content and matter in order, right, to make it a lot more interesting. And here you use a very strong opening and ending, right, in order to make it a lot more appealing and convincing for people. Here you use pace in a slightly different manner, right? The earlier thing we talked about, clarity and pace, is to make sure that you're not speaking too fast, right, to the point where it is not understandable. But in this case, you don't want to be speaking so slow that it becomes boring, and at the same time, you don't want to become monotonous in any pace. Someone speaking fast at a same, right, tempo for the entire speech will become boring, and someone speaking very slowly, again at the same tempo, becomes very boring as well. So we want some sort of variation in pace, in volume, in tone, right? All of this to make sure that there is sufficient conviction from people as well. And one final thing, this is the part of visual, right, conviction that we're looking at as well. It doesn't sound terribly convincing when the speakers are just staring at the floor, right, and they're very afraid of eye contact, and we want to see that level of comfort when they deliver the speeches, and so this falls under the category of delivery. And finally, language, right? In terms of language, once again, we need everyone to cover the basics. This might be a challenge, according to some of the teachers that have given feedback before, and they say, I have to make sure that my students' grammar is in basically good shape as well. So a lot of the time, it does happen that the students get very comfortable with the use of colloquialism, right? And they might actually end up having grammatical structures which are actually not considered correct. A little bit too much Singlish, or they just get a little bit sloppy with the grammar as well. So we will look out for that, and so this is something that they need to keep in mind. Again, right, pronunciation It matters for both delivery as well as for language, because we're testing you under two different conditions. One, for delivery earlier, we talked about the fact that you have to make your words clear and be precise, because it does interfere with the ability for people to understand what word you actually use. But we also insist that you are actually going to be proficient in the English language and you know how to pronounce words properly, right? And again, the way that you articulate and enunciate certain words are going to be looked out for as well. The end consonants, for instance. So, or the length of the vowels, etc., can be an issue as well. It's a very common thing for a lot of students to shorten their vowels. For instance, the place where you leave your vehicles overnight really should be the car park, not car park. Right? And so this is often, and they can't, for instance, differentiate between sit and seat, right? So they might say, have a seat, have a sit, and that usually becomes a problem. So do you want me to sit where? In the sit, right? And so this sort of things ought to be resolved as well. At the same time, we're looking for word choice that is appropriate to the topic and the register, the ability to choose words that will be appropriate. If someone decides to talk about genocide, right, we are looking for someone who can describe genocide as abominable, right, deplorable, like tragic, not sad, or genocide is bad. I mean, does the job but barely, right? And I think in this case it's almost completely inappropriate. And if we can actually have students articulating, right, a rich vocabulary designed to add value, because some students believe that if I throw out as many words with as many syllables as possible, I'm impressive. That shouldn't be the way to go. It is about ensuring that you're using words that will actually add value to the speech. And if they can articulate using very precise expressions, that means that you are able to gauge which word is the absolute best to be used under these circumstances. That's what we're looking for. And finally, an economy of expression as well. You can say within one word or a single phrase, and you're able to capture, right, the sentiments rather than to have to spend 5, 6, 7 lines trying to explain it, then you are going to be the superior candidate, and that's what we're looking out for as well. And finally, right, for the exceptional students, we'll often see them using the following techniques, right? They'll be witty, not necessarily like laugh out loud funny, but they're having fun, right, out there, and they demonstrate it by wielding, right, the English language as well as their speech as a tool, right, and they're very comfortable with it, and they're really exploiting all the subtleties and the beauty of the language in this case. This is a non-exhaustive list here. You can use puns, you can use double meanings of certain words, and you can turn the phrase around, right, to show that they're very comfortable with this particular use of language as well, right? I want to go a little bit deeper into how you might be able to prepare your students for the following topic. And this is just some good practices and some tips that you can provide as well. One, when the students are under pressure, they often end up not having a particular message or a takeaway, right, in this case. They decide that, you know what, I'm just going to come up, as I stand here, I'm just going to rattle on, and hopefully some sort of like speech will materialize. It's actually easier for them to start the preparation, that 5-minute prep, with one message or more, but one key message or takeaway, and then build the speech around it so that there is at least a clear takeaway. If the audience members are asked, what was their speech about? At least 80% of them, if not more, should be able to summarize it in one sentence, and all generally should agree. And that's the takeaway that we have. And what did you take from that? Oh, I've learned that homework is a terrible thing, and we should ban it, right? And so that's the thing, that's the point of the speech, and we should actually be able to take it away. It helps with the preparation. It also ensures that they recognize what speeches are designed to be used for, to ensure that people got the message and internalize it as much as possible. And this is actually, again, effective communication. How do you actually ensure that they are going to be able to develop a message? Because a lot of the time, they see a topic and they go, what on earth do I say about this? And during the practice, what you can help, right, is give them some topics, right, and the school will be very happy to provide you with some examples, right, of the questions and topics which have come up before in this tournament, and you can make them look at this from a different actor's perspective. How would a young person view it? How would the elderly view it? How would a politician see it? How might a doctor see it? And ask them to deliver speeches again and again so that it helps them see a particular topic from a different perspective and allow them to bring that multiplicity of views into the speech so that they're in a much better position to prepare. Or you can look at different angles, right? Different from physical actors, which are a little bit easier to see. But some students generally are unable to think of other actors, a little bit more sheltered perhaps, or they just cannot imagine being in someone else's shoes. So what they can do instead is essentially to focus on things like, we look at it from the perspective of justice. We'll look at it from the perspective of economics, long term, right? And so that's actually a different way. Some students are a little bit more comfortable with that, and you can use it as well. We'll now look at the message, right? And just how you can actually strengthen that particular issue about the message, right? Don't just stand there and say that, hey, homework is terrible, and this is my position. We actually would like individuals to explain, right? Go into a little bit more depth. We often find that some of the candidates which do not make it to the subsequent rounds tend not to explain. There is an expectation that the audience member knows, right, what they're talking about, and as a result you end up creating a great disconnect. And to make it stronger, you need to show the how and when, give case examples, right, to make it a little bit clearer for everyone how the content is actually supposed to be done. And when you actually want to practice with them, to make sure that their speeches tend to feature real-world examples, etc., you want to force them to use real-world examples within their practice speeches as well. Because some of the students will just come and say, let's just talk about my life, because that's what they're most comfortable with, or they can talk about school, and that's about it. It tends to really narrow the range of topics that they can, or the types of speeches they can craft from the topics that are being given to them. So you can actually practice this a little bit more by forcing them to that. I want at least 3 real-world examples, right? And you responding, let them research a bit, and then after that, that also gives them an armory, right, of different examples that they can use and wield within the contest itself. We also, right, in terms of the content part, if you want to, and this is something that some students feel a little bit more comfortable with, you can also craft a little narrative or a story so that it doesn't sound like a very cut and dry, argumentative essay that you're just regurgitating here. So you can basically make it a little bit more interesting by putting a personal bent on it. You can focus on the story which is related to you personally, or to a famous person, and you build a narrative around that, or to a fictional element as well, and we'll use the thematic device of a fairy tale in order to craft my speech. This just makes it a little bit more interesting and makes the content a bit more relevant as well. In terms of the drills for this, you really want them to practice the openings, because if you get the opening anchored around your main message and your main narrative, you actually have the ability to develop that point a lot further. And the start is actually very important here. So you get them to practice. If you want to start with a joke, that's fine. A strong quote to actually start the narrative flow, that's okay as well. Or the anecdotes that we talked about, personal as well as famous. This actually makes the content a lot stronger here. We'll now go to delivery, right? And some of the practices that you can use for delivery. 1, they have to get used to high volume delivery and low volume delivery. So that means that you have to get them practicing, because a lot of them just stand and practice and they just use the same register. We will be switching to different venues. Some of it will be in classrooms, and then after that, subsequently, you'll come into a large venue as well. So they need to get used to the high volume and low volume in order to make it a lot more controlled. And it's the same thing. You need to try to control their pace, right? By making them pause and breathe, right? As well, you need to teach them enunciation. And in order to do some of these drills, for volume, I suggest that you actually allow them to speak in your school's large venues. Football field, if you want to, right? It's very entertaining, and the football team looks on with wonder at someone screaming. That's fine, right? Or you make them speak at a distance of about 1 foot, right? So that they have to learn how to use almost a stage whisper. This will teach them the variation as well. Pace, right? And some of the drills that we have here, right, are actually quite useful in terms of teaching pace, etc. 1, scripted delivery is this, especially if they're just starting out and they're still not very comfortable. We want them to focus on delivery rather than to have to worry about the speech. You can just give them famous speeches or make them write the speeches ahead of time and then make them deliver this when you focus on delivery correction so that they will look at the scripts and then be able to adjust and deliver it, and then you can make the correction. Second, pen drill, right? It's a little exercise that you have where you take the pen, you basically put it into your house like a horse's bit, right? And then make them deliver through that. A variation is for people to put marbles and stones into your mouth, but hard to find clean marbles and stones these days, and they might swallow it, right? So the pen drill is to make them like, it's essentially a form of resistance training so that they articulate through the pen and learn how to deliver it as well. The chair drill, right, is essentially for the individuals who are so nervous that most of their energy and attention is spent running around, right? And you need to make them learn how to deliver in a very calm manner, right? When they're seated, they tend to be a lot more comfortable because it now feels like a dinner table conversation. And as a result, they get very comfortable with that. So some of my more nervous trainees, I make them just sit in the chair, right? And then you deliver. And they're a lot more relaxed. Their weight is fully carried by the chair, and so they're much more comfortable as well. Then I might make them stand up slowly in the middle of the speech, right, in order for them to get more comfortable. Auditorium drill is for those people who are a little bit, and this is what I talked about, using a very large venue so that they actually get how it feels to speak in a large venue as well. Visual delivery, right? This might require you to use a slightly larger venue. You can have students planted as listeners, but essentially you're forcing them to make eye contact as much as possible when they deliver. It is useful, it's actually more useful to make them practice this with a script because you want to get them used to looking at people. This one is less of a problem actually at our tournament because there is nothing that you're supposed to hold. But we find that even with nothing to look at in your hands, they still avoid looking at people. So they need to learn to get comfortable. So you may have to do some awkward things, such as just make sure that they just stare at you and say, we're going to do eye contact for 5 minutes, right? It'll feel slightly creepy after a while, right? But they need to get comfortable with that, or little tricks such as look at the forehead, not into the eyes if they feel that it's a little bit too uncomfortable. And right, the pan and scan, which is essentially move right around the room with your eyes to look at different parts. Some people say follow an M shape or a W shape as long as you're moving around to make sure that you look. So I've actually put like different colored markers on different chairs. You have to keep looking right at the 5 different objects, and then you go back, and so that they get more comfortable doing that as well. Gestures and movements, it's a little bit broad, and I don't want to generalize too much because people tend to have a lot of different types of gestures, some which are appropriate and some which can be useful, but I can't say definitively that a certain gesture will always be bad because it might suit different people in a different way. The key thing about gestures and movement we want to articulate is that it ought to be under control, that it is actually willful use of the limbs, right, and the movement of the body in order to make a point, rather than like nervous, weird line dancing thing that some of the students tend to do, especially when their weight is on one foot, etc. So movement is fine, but it has to be controlled movement. And some students have used movement very well, right, to articulate. They will, if they're moving to a different section, they might move to a different part of the stage, right, as well, and they're willing to make big gestures, right, and some of them actually have delivered the most outstanding speeches, literally standing like a statue, right, but the voice is so powerful, and they felt that the movement was actually a distraction, so that can work as well, right. Some drills, if you want to make them a little bit more conscious about the movement part, right, big hands. Big hands essentially means you will almost act like a mime, right? You tell them that unless, right, act everything out, and we want to see big gestures, and we basically want to make sure that you are going to be almost word you try to describe, right? Okay, so, right, I want it that way, you're in my heart, right? Whatever it is, and it's quite fun as well, and they learn to see that some gestures are actually quite useful, right? And they will learn to mitigate what works and what doesn't work as well. So instead of just saying, oh, there's a glass ceiling for women, let's say, there's a glass ceiling for women. That helps a little bit more. Small hands is for the people who doesn't quite know what to do with their hands. You need to make them a little bit more, calm. Some of them just like take their hands and then because they're moving too much, they shove it into their pockets. But they don't realize that they continue moving it, right? It looks very awkward, right? So the way I teach them is we're going to make you deliver the speech, but with your hands under control. So if they can control that, say, okay, no moving. Every time you move your hands, because they're itching to move their hands, right? Punishment can be like a fine, or you make them restart the speech. I make some of them sit down, combining the chair drill, sit on their hands. And then they learn that, okay, the only thing I can articulate and move is my mouth. I have to learn to use that. Eventually, the hands are like, okay, I can't move, that's fine, right? So that can work as well. The other drill is to see what they're more comfortable with, forcing them to stand absolutely still. At times, one child moved so much, I had to weigh him down with bags. Basically, we built a small pyramid of bags around his legs so that he doesn't move at all. And then he's like, oh, okay, this is fine. I actually don't know what all the fuss about. And then eventually he got still. But you also want them to try pacing so that they learn how to do it. To see, some of them can talk and walk at the same time. For others, it's a disaster. The brain cannot process the two things. So see what happens, right, when you actually practice this as well. And finally, language. In terms of grammar, this is really your field more than mine, but we do want you to be a lot more conscious about it, because sometimes I think we're more concerned about the way they write rather than the way they speak, right? It's only when there is English oral and then we start working on this again. So any errors that they have, please correct it early and don't wait until, because this is something that is hardwired into their brains, and you may actually need to make them correct it again and again, right? If necessary, right? Oh, beg your pardon, there's a typo there. If in doubt, make sure that they are keeping the sentences shorter, right? As once they start using compound language, compound sentences, connectors, etc., that's when it tends to get a little bit more complicated, and they can't handle it, right? In this case, it will limit the variation you can create in your speeches, because sometimes you do need those long sentences for exposition, but this, right, as a shortcut, can actually make it, can be a problem. Next thing, keep it simple and just keep it clear, right? Pronunciation is going to be a problem when they are handling big words, when they're using words that they ordinarily do not actually employ in their daily speech. So this is going to be two different demands. You want to keep it, you want to make the speech interesting. You do want to showcase your vocabulary, but it should not actually come at the expense of losing your ability to control the pronunciation. So I always tell my speakers, yes, right? If you need to say things have gotten worse, and if you feel like you can use the word exacerbate because it suits it so much better, use it. But a number of my students cannot say exacerbate, and I say, okay, why don't we just stick to things get worse? And then okay, thank you. Right, okay, so this is you have to try to monitor that a little. Some of them will be very stubborn and will insist on trying to use the word. Sometimes certain types of words just don't work for people, and just keep that in mind. Vocabulary drills, right, is going to be interesting. This is where you often make them push their vocabulary as much as possible. It's larger than we think, but they just never go beyond a static list that they tend to use. So drills will include things like, here's a word, I want you to say this word or this line in another way, and tell me again in another way. So, I'm happy. Now, I want you to say you're happy in a different way. I say, I'm overjoyed. Okay, again, I'm ecstatic. Okay, again, I'm over the moon. Again, right? I'm on cloud nine. Again, right? So until you are satisfied that this will become a very comfortable thing. This will also help to showcase which students are naturally comfortable having a wider range of vocabulary and who tends to be a little bit more limited here. Different ways, right, towards the same end, meaning that you now go a little bit longer. They have the same message for the speech, but you now essentially tell me that story again in a different way, right? That means that you look at it from a different actor's perspective, right? Okay. First, you told me homework is terrible for you as a student. Now I want you to tell me how homework is terrible for us as the teachers, right? Okay. Students forget that teachers are human too, right? And this is why a good time to remind them that marking is a terrible thing for everyone involved, right? Finally, it is going to be a very challenging thing in terms of the student's psychology. It's a frightening thing. We don't even give them the comfort of notes. We don't give them the comfort of a prepared speech. We are throwing them into the deep end with the sharks and say, you have 5 minutes, go, right? So it can be very nerve-wracking, and public speaking, right, by itself is already quite challenging for people as well. some things that you can do to build up confidence, but be careful, right? Because you have to be careful in how you're approaching. You know your students well as well. Sometimes you need to stress test the speakers, meaning that you need to put them under even harder conditions so that they're used to it, and then the competition won't catch them off guard. Give them 2 minutes to prepare the speech. Then suddenly when they come for the tournament, 5 minutes is, oh, a lot of time, it's not a problem. Give them no time, right? So here's the topic, go, right? And you deliver the speech. Throw things at them, try not to hit them, of course, or throw softer things, right? Have people yelling at them, right, throughout the speech. So these are little things to get them used, right, to the fact that I'm having to deliver this under a slightly more stressful condition as well. At the same time, you do need to keep it light and positive, and generally we have to remember to give them positive reinforcement as much as we give them stress as well, to assure them that this was good, right? Because instinctively a lot of them tend to think, that was a bad speech. So please be sure to showcase, here's where this was really, really good, and I like that, right? And this happens to be quite good. But I found that self-review, especially in the long term, is a very, very important tool. They need to get comfortable with their idea that they are speaking, that this is a normal activity for them. So I'll actually videotape them, audio at the very least, but I videotape them and make them watch to get used to this idea that I am speaking, right? Because for a lot of them, it's an alien activity. A lot of them have, not a lot of them, some of them have actually been very disturbed by listening or watching themselves speak. They say, I sound weird. A boy has cried before when I actually showed him his old speech. He just couldn't take it, just burst out in tears, right? So, but eventually, we want to normalize it, and they say, watch it again, and do it on your own time. And as they do that, they become a lot more self-aware, right? And that actually helps with confidence, and they can do that. On the tournament itself, right, it will be very stressful. Suddenly strange faces abound, stern-looking judges and all that. Make sure that they always have the ability to think of a happy place, right, whatever relaxes them as well. Music, food, right, comforting, whatever it is, comforting thoughts and words of encouragement, it can help. Another trick for them is to make them practice visualization of perfection. That means I want you to mentally see yourself delivering a perfect speech, right? Hear yourself delivering that, so that this forms a sort of rehearsal for them mentally, so that they know that this is something I've actually done before. Now, during the speech itself, there isn't much we can do to help with the confidence, but there is a part, if you can execute it well, you feel good, and that's the start, right? So if any part of the speech ought to be focused on, especially from a psychological perspective, is to make sure that they start strong. I can see students literally being like lifted up, right, okay, in triumph when they realize they just nailed that opening, right, and then they feel like I'm on a very strong footing. Conversely, right, when they bomb the opening, right, my name is John, oh wait, that's not my name, right, when that happens, the rest of the speech just crumbles. It's very difficult to build it up again, right, so they have to nail the opening, and this is something they need to practice. Here are some topics that I've given you run before as well, right, and again, these are not the ones coming up this year, right? Of course, you won't know, right? But this is just an idea if you want to get a little bit more, right? Okay, are we okay with releasing them? If requested, yeah? Okay, we can give up. Not the one from this year. Oh, previous year. Yeah, previous years, right, as well. So this is not an issue, right? Okay, so these are the type of topics as well. And that's it for today, right? So at this point, we actually want to, we really wanted to make sure, right, that everybody got, right, the broad gist of what the tournament is actually offering you. Questions?